To Talia, Julian Blackwood proclaimed, his wine glass held high like a scepter. May this birthday be the beginning of something extraordinary. He watched her raise her crystal glass. A pawn moved perfectly into checkmate. In his eyes, she was merely an asset draped in a pink dress, a naive girl, unaware of the untraceable sedative waiting in her glass. He believed the poison was his to dispense, and that victory was already in his grasp. But as Talia's smile curved, a cold glint in her eyes he'd completely overlooked told a different story. Julian had poured the cup of deceit, but little did he know, she had already prepared a cup of her own for him, one filled to the brim with consequences. How does a pawn outplay the king? Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the moment the tables turn. Let us know in the comments below. If you were in Talia's shoes, knowing everything she knows, what would your first move be? The chandelier's crystal facets caught the light like 1,000 tiny stars, casting a glittering haze over the grand hall of the Blackwood mansion. Laughter bubbled through the air, mingling with the soft clink of champagne flutes and the distant hum of a string quartet playing a waltz that felt too cheerful for the undercurrent of tension. Guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns milled about, their conversations laced with the easy confidence of old money. At the center of it all stood Talia, her elegant pink dress a soft contrast against the sea of opulence, though she felt more like an intruder than the guest of honor. The birthday party had been Genevieve's idea, or so she'd claimed with that saccharine smile earlier in the evening. "Darling, you deserve this," her aunt had said, her voice dripping with feigned warmth. As she adjusted a stray fold on Talia's gown, Talia had nodded politely, but inside, a knot twisted in her stomach. Celebrations in this house were rare for her, and when they came, they always carried an edge, like a gift wrapped in thorns. She scanned the room, noting the familiar faces, business associates of her Uncle Julian, socialites who whispered behind fans, and a few distant relatives who treated her with a polite detachment reserved for someone who didn't quite belong. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne, but to Talia, it smelled of pretense. She clutched her glass of untouched sparkling water, her fingers tracing the stem as if it were a lifeline. Why now? She wondered, her mind racing through the past week's oddities, the sudden kindness from Julian and Genevieve, the hushed phone calls she'd overheard from the hallway. "Seaview Point will be ours soon," Julian had murmured once, his voice low and urgent. The words had lingered in her thoughts like a shadow, refusing to fade. A ripple of silence spread through the crowd as Julian Blackwood stepped onto the small dais at the far end of the hall. He was the picture of charisma, his posture straight and commanding, a man who commanded rooms without effort. The quartet faded to a hush, and all eyes turned to him. Talia felt her pulse quicken, a familiar wariness settling in her chest. Julian raised his engraved wine glass, the red liquid inside catching the light like blood in crystal. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying the practiced timbre of a man used to sealing deals. "Tonight we gather not just to celebrate a birthday, but to honor a legacy. Talia, my dear niece, you've grown into, well, quite the young woman." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with a smile that didn't reach them. The guests murmured approvingly, but Talia saw the calculation there, the way his gaze flicked over her as if appraising an asset. She shifted slightly, her heart pounding. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in with their gilded frames and antique portraits of stern ancestors, none of whom looked like her. Julian continued, his words weaving a tapestry of false nostalgia. "Your father, my late brother-in-law, was a visionary. Seaview Point, that breathtaking stretch of land overlooking the ocean, was his dream. A place of promise, of untapped potential. And now as Talia steps into her future, we mark this moment of transition. From the shadows of loss to the light of inheritance. The guests applauded lightly, raising their glasses in unison. Talia's grip tightened further, her knuckles paling against the stem. Transition. The word echoed in her mind, like a warning bell. What did he mean by that? Her father's land wasn't just property. It was a sanctuary, a piece of him she'd clung to through years of quiet endurance in this house. Julian had always eyed it greedily, his conversations peppered with hints of development, of turning it into something profitable. But tonight, his tone carried an undercurrent of finality that set her nerves on edge. "To Talia," Julian proclaimed, his glass held high, "may this birthday be the beginning of something extraordinary. And to family, the ties that bind us through thick and thin." The room echoed the toast, glasses clinking like distant thunder. Talia forced a smile, lifting her own glass but barely sipping. The sparkling water tasted flat on her tongue, a poor substitute for the wine everyone else indulged in. She caught Genevieve's eye across the room. Her aunt's lips curved in a perfect arc, but her gaze was sharp, appraising, as if waiting for a slip. As the applause died down, Julian descended the dais, weaving through the crowd with handshakes and nods. He reached Talia, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "My dear," he said softly, his breath carrying the faint tang of wine, "this night is about you, but before the evening ends we should have a little chat, just the two of us, in my study. There's a special gift waiting, something to make this official." Talia's stomach churned. A gift? In all her years under this roof, gifts from Julian had come with strings attached, favors, expectations, subtle manipulations. She glanced around, noting how the guests had resumed their chatter, oblivious to the subtle shift in the air. Genevieve hovered nearby, her presence a silent reinforcement, her eyes flicking between them with barely concealed anticipation. "Of course, Uncle," Talia replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside. She couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when every instinct screamed that this chat was more than it seemed. Julian's smile widened, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something almost triumphant. He gestured toward the hallway leading to his study, the corridor lined with shadows from the flickering sconces. They moved through the crowd, Talia's steps measured, her mind racing. Whispers followed them. "Such a lucky girl," one guest murmured, "inheriting all that." Another chuckled softly. Talia ignored them, focusing on the door ahead, the heavy oak barrier that separated the public facade from whatever private scheme awaited. Julian opened it with a flourish, ushering her inside. The room was dimly lit by a desk lamp, the air heavy with the scent of aged leather and cigar smoke. Bookshelves loomed like silent judges, filled with volumes on finance and real estate, Julian's true passions. He closed the door behind them with a resounding click, the sound echoing like a lock turning in a cell. Talia stood there, the weight of the evening pressing down. Outside, the party continued, muffled laughter seeping through the walls. But in here, the real game was about to begin. She met Julian's gaze, her resolve hardening. Whatever he had planned, she wouldn't go down without a fight. The echo of the study door's heavy click lingered in Talia's mind as she stood in the dimly lit hallway, the muffled laughter from the party fading like a distant dream. Her fingers still gripped the glass of sparkling water, now warm from her clammy hold. Julian's words, a special gift, rang hollow, laced with an intent she couldn't yet name but felt in her bones. A week ago, she might have dismissed it as paranoia, but the past 7 days had sharpened her instincts, each moment building toward this night like stones in a path leading to a trap. The scene shifted, pulling back to the previous week, to the quiet drudgery of Talia's life in the Blackwood mansion. Dawn light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the marble floor as she scrubbed pots in silence. The house was a mausoleum of wealth: polished wood, crystal vases, portraits of pale ancestors staring down with cold eyes. Talia moved through it like a ghost, her presence tolerated but never embraced. Genevieve's voice cut through the morning stillness, sharp and deliberate. "Really, Talia, you must try to be tidier. This house has standards." The words carried a familiar sting, a reminder that Talia's place here was beneath the polished veneer of the Blackwood name. She didn't respond, her hand steady as she rinsed a plate, but her mind churned. Genevieve's barbs weren't new, subtle jabs about her background or fit in their world, but they'd grown sharper lately, as if testing her resolve. Talia had learned to swallow the hurt, to let it fuel her quiet determination. She wasn't just surviving here, she was waiting, biding her time until the day she could claim what was hers. Seaview Point, her father's land, wasn't just dirt and ocean views, it was his heart, his dream of a place where beauty outlasted greed. She wouldn't let it slip away. The change had started 5 days ago, abrupt and unnerving. Julian, usually distant, had begun calling her dear niece, his smiles too wide, his questions about her plans too pointed. Genevieve, ever the actress, had joined in, fussing over party details with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "A proper celebration for you," she'd said, her eyes avoiding Talia's. "You're practically family after all." The words were honeyed, but Talia caught the lie beneath them, like a bitter aftertaste. Family didn't make you sleep in the attic or eat alone in the kitchen. Late one night, unable to sleep, Talia had crept downstairs for water, pausing at the sound of Julian's voice from his study. The door was ajar, just enough for his words to slip through. "Seaview Point will cover it all," he'd said, his tone urgent, almost desperate. "One signature, and the debts are gone. The hotel group's offer is final." A pause, then Genevieve's reply, cold and precise. "She won't suspect a thing. She's too trusting." Talia's breath caught, her bare feet frozen on the cold floor. She'd retreated silently, her heart pounding with a clarity she couldn't ignore. They were plotting something, and it centered on her father's legacy. The next morning, as she swept the grand staircase, the memory of their words gnawed at her. Trusting? No. She'd stopped being that girl years ago when she learned that kindness in this house always came with a price. But a flicker of hope lingered, a stubborn wish that maybe, just maybe, they'd changed. She hated that part of herself, the part that still craved a family, even one that saw her as an outsider. She pushed it down, focusing on the broom's rhythm, each stroke grounding her resolve. That evening, alone in her attic room, Talia opened her laptop, her fingers hesitating over the keys. She'd been studying business law online in secret, a lifeline to the future she envisioned, one where she could protect her father's dream. The screen glowed with an unread email, the sender's name unfamiliar, R. Sterling. The subject line read, "Urgent, your father's wish." Her pulse quickened as she clicked, scanning the brief message. "Talia, I was your father's friend and legal partner. He entrusted me with something for you. Meet me tomorrow, 3 p.m., at the Oakwood Cafe. Tell no one. Destroy this email." She read it twice, her mind racing. Robert Sterling, a name she vaguely recalled from her father's stories. A man he'd trusted. Could this be a trap? Or a lifeline? Her fingers hovered over the delete button, but something in the message's tone, the urgency, the mention of her father, felt real. She deleted it, ensuring no trace remained, and shut the laptop. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, she lay awake, weighing hope against caution, her father's memory urging her forward. Back in the present, Talia stood outside Julian's study, the party's distant hum a stark contrast to the silence of the hallway. The email had been her first step toward unraveling the Blackwood scheme, and now, with Julian waiting inside, she felt the weight of her father's warning. Whatever gift he had planned, she was ready, not as the trusting girl they expected, but as a woman forging her own path. The heavy oak door loomed before Talia, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow of the hallway sconces. The muffled laughter from the party felt a world away, drowned out by the pulse hammering in her ears. Julian's voice echoed in her mind, a special gift. But the cryptic email from Robert Sterling, deleted but seared into her memory, anchored her resolve. She wasn't stepping into his study blind, not anymore. The weight of last week's discoveries pressed against her, pulling her thoughts back to the moment everything changed, the clandestine meeting that had armed her with her father's truth. 6 days earlier, Talia slipped out of the Blackwood mansion under the guise of an errand, her heart racing as she navigated the bustling streets to the Oakwood Cafe. The small, unassuming shop sat tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, its faded awning and chipped wooden sign a stark contrast to the opulence she'd left behind. Inside, the air smelled of roasted coffee and fresh pastries, a warmth that eased the knot in her chest. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a man in a gray coat, sitting alone at a corner table. His posture was upright but not rigid, his expression calm yet purposeful. Robert Sterling. He rose as she approached, his handshake firm but gentle. "Talia," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of familiarity. "You look like your father when you're determined." The words caught her off guard, stirring a pang of longing for the man she'd lost too soon. She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, wary but curious. Robert's eyes, steady and kind, held no trace of deception, but she'd learned to trust sparingly in the Blackwood household. "I was your father's friend and legal partner," Robert began, sliding a small wooden box across the table. Its surface was worn, etched with faint carvings of waves, her father's signature touch a nod to Seaview Point. "He wanted you to have this when the time came." Talia's fingers brushed the wood, her breath catching. She opened it to find a folded letter, a copy of a will, and a bundle of documents tied with twine. The letter, in her father's precise handwriting, was addressed to her. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words as Robert watched in silence. "My dearest Talia," it began, "if you're reading this, you're at a crossroads. Seaview Point is yours, not just as land, but as my heart's work, a place to preserve beauty and hope. Julian will try to take it. His greed is a beast that devours trust. On your birthday, he'll offer a toast, a contract, a lie. Don't drink, don't sign. Trust your instincts and lean on Robert. He's family in all but blood." Each sentence landed like a stone, heavy with warning and love. Her throat tightened, the words blurring as she fought back tears. Robert spoke softly, filling the silence. "Your father suspected Julian's intentions years ago. He tried to forge the will after the accident, claiming Seaview Point for himself. I stopped him, but he's desperate now. His debts are crushing him. A hotel conglomerate wants the land, and he sees it as his salvation." Talia's mind flashed to Julian's late-night call, his voice dripping with urgency about one signature. The pieces clicked together, sharp and cold. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert leaned forward, his tone grave. "Your father's will locks the estate until your birthday. After that, it's yours, unless Julian tricks you into signing it away. He's been planning this for months, maybe years." He tapped the documents. "These prove Seaview Point's value. Millions, Talia. But more than that, They prove your father's trust in you." She clutched the letter, her father's words a lifeline through the fog of betrayal. Julian and Genevieve's sudden kindness, their lavish party plans, it was all a performance, a trap dressed in silk and smiles. She thought of Genevieve's barbed remarks, the way she'd sneered about Talia's fit in their world, a subtle reminder of her place as the outsider in their pristine white circle. But her father's letter burned away that doubt, replacing it with fire. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting for what was hers. Robert slid a card across the table. "Call me if you need me, but be careful. They're watching you." Talia nodded, tucking the card and box into her bag. She left the cafe, the weight of her father's warning settling into her bones. She wouldn't let Julian win. Back in the present, Talia stood before the study door, the memory of that letter grounding her. Julian's gift waited inside, but so did her plan. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Trust your instincts." She straightened, her resolve a quiet blade. Whatever lay beyond that door, she was no longer the prey. The study door loomed like a gateway to a chessboard, each move inside calculated to outmaneuver or ensnare. Talia's hand hovered over the brass handle, her father's letter echoing in her mind. Don't drink, don't sign. The weight of Robert Sterling's revelations, Julian's debts, the hotel conglomerate's offer, the forged will attempt, had sharpened her senses. She wasn't the naive girl Julian expected, not anymore. The party's distant hum faded as she steeled herself, her mind flashing back to the moments that had transformed her from prey to predator. 5 days before the party, Talia had begun her quiet rebellion. The Blackwood mansion, with its polished surfaces and cold silences, was a stage for deception. But she'd learned to play her part. While dusting Julian's study, she'd accidentally dropped her purse near his desk, her fingers deftly sliding a tiny recording device beneath a stack of papers. The move was risky. Genevieve's watchful eyes missed little, her comments about Talia's place a constant reminder of her outsider status. But the gamble paid off. That night, in the attic's dim light, she listened to the recording through earbuds, her breath catching at the sound of Julian's voice. "It's simple," he'd said, his tone clipped and confident. "The wine's laced with a sedative, mild, untraceable. She'll sign the contract before she even feels it." Genevieve's laugh followed, sharp and cruel. "That girl, she's too caught up in her father's fairy tales to suspect anything. Seaview Point will be ours, and she'll be out of our hair." The words stung, not for their venom, but for their underestimation. They saw her as a pawn, oblivious to the queen she was becoming. Talia had replayed the recording, memorizing every detail. The specific bottle of vintage Bordeaux, the contract disguised as a formality, the plan to rush her signature before the sedative dulled her senses. Genevieve's voice lingered, dripping with disdain for Talia's roots, a coded jab at her heritage that only fueled her resolve. She'd spent hours in her room, her laptop open to her online business law course, cross-referencing the documents Robert had given her. The will was ironclad. Seaview Point was hers, but only if she could outwit Julian's scheme. Back at the party, Talia moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her earlier nervousness a deliberate mask. She declined a flute of champagne from a waiter with a polite smile, her excuse about preferring water masking her vigilance. Every glass, every gesture was suspect now. She'd caught Genevieve's glance earlier, a flicker of satisfaction that hadn't been there before, as if the trap was already closing. But Talia was no longer reacting. She was orchestrating. 3 days ago, she'd tested her suspicions. Late at night, she'd slipped into the kitchen, where the staff stored the party's provisions. Hidden among crates of wine was the Bordeaux from the recording, its label unmistakable. She didn't touch it, but the sight confirmed her fears. The next morning, while Genevieve was out, Talia had volunteered to help arrange the party decor, using the chaos to slip back into Julian's study. She retrieved the recorder, ensuring no trace remained. Each step was a thread in the web she was weaving, her father's warning, her guide. Now, standing in the hall, Talia felt the weight of those preparations. The guests' chatter, murmurs of her good fortune and such a generous uncle, grated against her. They saw what Julian wanted them to see, a dutiful niece, grateful for scraps of kindness. But she saw the board clearly now, every piece in place. Julian's toast, with its talk of transition, wasn't a celebration. It was a prelude to theft. Genevieve's hovering presence, her two perfect smiles, was the curtain hiding the blade. Talia's mind flashed to a moment from the previous night, alone in her attic room. She'd sat cross-legged on the floor, the will spread before her, her father's letter in hand. "Trust your instincts," he'd written. She'd traced the words, feeling his strength in them. Julian and Genevieve thought her weak, a girl softened by loss and isolation. They were wrong. She'd studied, planned, and waited, turning their arrogance into her weapon. The study door beckoned, the final move in this opening gambit. Talia exhaled, her resolve a quiet fire. She wasn't just walking into Julian's trap, she was setting one of her own. The party's noise faded entirely as she pushed the door open, stepping into the dim light of the study. Julian stood waiting, his smile as polished as the glass in his hand. But Talia was ready, her every step a checkmate in waiting. The study door clicked shut behind Talia, sealing her in with Julian and the weight of their unspoken game. The room was a fortress of ambition. Dark mahogany shelves lined with books on wealth and power, a faint cigar smoke haze clinging to the air. Julian stood by his antique desk, a crystal decanter of Bordeaux gleaming under the desk lamp's glow. His smile was all charm, but Talia saw the predator beneath, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose forged over days of planning. Her father's warning, "Don't drink, don't sign," was her shield, and the recording she'd retrieved was her sword. Julian gestured to a leather chair across from him, his movements smooth, almost theatrical. "Sit, Talia," he said, his voice warm but edged with something sharper. "Tonight's a milestone. We should celebrate properly." He reached for the decanter, pouring deep red wine into two engraved glasses, the liquid catching the light like a warning. Talia sat, her posture composed, her hands folded in her lap to hide their faint tremble. She'd heard the plan on the recording. Sedative in the wine, a contract to steal Seaview Point. But hearing it and facing it were worlds apart. He slid one glass toward her, the crystal scraping softly against the desk's polished surface. "To your future," he said, raising his own glass, his eyes locked on hers. Talia didn't touch hers. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her gaze steady, studying him. The recording had revealed more than just the plot. It had exposed Julian's arrogance, his belief that she was too simple, too shaped by her roots to see through him. Genevieve's voice had echoed that disdain, a reminder of the barriers they assumed she couldn't cross. But they'd underestimated her, and that was their mistake. Julian's smile faltered just for a moment before he pressed on. "Your father would be proud," he said, leaning back, his tone shifting to one of practiced sentiment. "I remember him talking about Seaview Point, his grand vision. But dreams need funding, Talia. That's where I come in." He reached into a drawer, producing a leather-bound folder and sliding it toward her. "This is your gift, a contract to formalize your inheritance. A simple signature, and Seaview Point is secure under our family's care." The word family landed like a stone. Talia's mind flashed to Genevieve's barbed comments, the years of being pushed to the margins of this house, tolerated but never embraced. She glanced at the contract, its pages pristine but heavy with intent. She knew what it was, a transfer of Seaview Point to Julian's control, disguised as a formality. Her fingers itched to flip it open, to call his bluff, but she held back, her strategy clear. She needed him to feel in control, to lower his guard. Instead, she looked at the wine glass, its contents shimmering with hidden danger. "A toast first, Uncle?" she asked, her voice calm, almost playful, but with an edge that made Julian pause. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "To family, as you said, to trust." She reached for her glass, holding it up, mirroring his pose. His smile returned tighter now as he nodded. "Exactly," he said, his voice a touch too eager. "To trust." He brought his glass to his lips, waiting for her to do the same. Talia's pulse quickened, but her mind was sharp, replaying the recording, her father's letter, the hours she'd spent preparing. She couldn't drink, but she couldn't refuse outright, not yet. She needed to turn his trap against him. "Then let's make it special," she said, her tone steady, her words deliberate. "If this is about family, about trust, let's share the moment fully." She paused, letting the silence build, then delivered her move. "Why don't we switch glasses? A gesture of unity, no secrets between us." Her words hung in the air, each one a challenge wrapped in innocence. Julian froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. His eyes darted to the glass in her hand, then back to his own, a flicker of panic breaking through his polished facade. "What?" he said, his laugh forced, brittle. "That's unnecessary, a silly tradition." He set his glass down, his hand unsteady, betraying the composure he'd clung to. Talia tilted her head, her smile faint but unyielding. "Is it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she knew. She held her glass out, offering the exchange, her gaze locked on his. Julian's face betrayed him, sweat beaded at his temple, his fingers twitching toward the contract, as if it could save him. The predator was cornered, and Talia, for the first time, felt the board tilt in her favor. The silence in Julian's study was a living thing, sharp and suffocating, as Talia held her wine glass outstretched, her challenge hanging between them like a drawn blade. Julian's face, moments ago a mask of smug control, now betrayed him. His eyes darted between the glasses, his hand frozen mid-air, the faintest tremor betraying his unraveling composure. Talia's words, "Why don't we switch glasses?" had sliced through his carefully staged performance, and the room felt charged with the weight of his unspoken guilt. She sat still, her gaze unyielding, watching the predator become prey. Julian forced a laugh, the sound brittle like glass cracking under pressure. "Talia, really," he said, setting his glass down with exaggerated care, his fingers lingering on the stem as if to anchor himself. "This is no time for games. It's a toast, not a ritual." His voice strained to reclaim authority, but the sweat beading at his temple told a different story. Talia didn't flinch. She kept her glass extended, her expression serene, but laced with a quiet defiance that made the air heavier. "Games?" she echoed softly, her tone carrying an edge of mockery. "I thought this was about trust, Uncle, family." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, daring him to look away. The word family landed like a barb, a reminder of the years she'd spent on the fringes of his world, her presence tolerated only as a means to an end. Genevieve's sneers about her roots echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve. They'd counted on her silence, her compliance, but she was done playing their pawn. Julian's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching toward the contract still lying on the desk, a leather-bound trap disguised as a gift. He cleared his throat, attempting to pivot. "Let's focus on what matters," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual polish. "This contract secures your future, Talia. Seaview Point is a burden you shouldn't carry alone. Sign it, and we'll manage it together as family should." He pushed the folder closer, his smile thin, desperate. Talia didn't glance at the contract. She'd seen its kind before, in the documents Robert Sterling had shown her. Pages designed to strip her of her father's legacy with a single signature. Instead, she lowered her glass, setting it beside his with deliberate precision, the crystal clinking softly against the desk. "If we're family," she said, her voice steady, "then we shouldn't need tricks to prove it." She paused, letting the accusation linger, watching his facade crack further. Julian's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through. "Tricks?" he said, his tone sharpening. "You're being absurd. This is about your father's dream, not some conspiracy." But his words faltered, and Talia caught the way his gaze flicked to the door, as if hoping for rescue or escape. She seized the moment, her hand dipping into her small clutch bag. "Then let's make it simple," she said, producing a slim folder of her own, its plain cover a stark contrast to Julian's ostentatious one. She slid it across the desk, her movements calm, calculated. "This is my proposal. A trust management contract drawn up by a lawyer I trust. It keeps Seaview Point under my control, but allows you a role if you sign it." Her voice was even, but the challenge was clear. Play by her rules or face exposure. Julian stared at the folder, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low, almost a growl. He flipped it open, scanning the pages, his fingers tightening as he realized its implications. The contract, prepared by Robert, ensured Talia's authority over Seaview Point while offering Julian a nominal advisory role, enough to save face, but nothing more. It was a checkmate disguised as compromise. "You thought I'd just sign away my father's dream?" Talia asked, her voice soft but cutting. "You thought I wouldn't notice the wine, the contract, the lies?" She leaned back, her posture relaxed, but her eyes burning with resolve. She didn't need to mention the recording or her father's letter. The weight of her knowledge hung between them, undeniable. Julian's hand hovered over her contract, his breathing uneven. He glanced at the glasses again, the Bordeaux glinting like a confession. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice strained. "We can discuss—" "No," Talia interrupted, her tone firm, final. "Sign it, or we go back to the toast. Your choice." The words were a mirror to his own arrogance, reflecting his trap back at him. She could almost hear Genevieve's voice from the recording, dismissing her as too caught up to fight back. They'd misjudged her, and now Julian sat cornered, his empire of deceit crumbling under her gaze. The door creaked faintly, and Talia's eyes flicked toward it. Genevieve's shadow lingered in the hallway, her presence a silent pressure. Talia's lips curved into a faint smile. Let her listen. Let them both realize the board had shifted. Julian's hand trembled as he reached for a pen, his defeat written in the slump of his shoulders. Talia watched, her heart steady, knowing this was only the beginning of her reclaiming what was hers. The air in Julian's study was thick with defeat, the silence broken only by the faint scratch of his pen against Talia's contract. Each stroke was a wound to his pride, his trembling hand betraying the collapse of his carefully laid plan. Talia sat across from him, her posture calm, her eyes unwavering as she watched him sign away his leverage. The crystal glasses on the desk, hers laced with sedative, his untouched, stood as silent witnesses to her victory. She'd turned his trap against him, her father's warning, and her own cunning forging a path where Julian had expected surrender. The weight of her counter-contract, now bearing his signature, was a chain he'd forged himself. Julian set the pen down, his movements slow, deliberate, as if stalling could undo the moment. His eyes flicked to the Bordeaux, its deep red glow a mocking reminder of his failed scheme. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice low, almost a growl, but the bravado rang hollow. Talia didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, her gaze steady, letting him feel the full weight of his miscalculation. He'd seen her as a naive girl, too shaped by her background to challenge him, a belief rooted in the same disdain Genevieve had wielded like a blade. But Talia was no pawn. She was the queen, and this was her board. She gathered both contracts, hers and the one Julian had hoped she'd sign, sliding them into her folder with measured precision. "It changes everything," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd outplayed a predator. She picked up her glass, the poisoned wine glinting under the lamp's light, and stood, her movements deliberate. Julian's eyes followed the glass, a flicker of panic crossing his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but Talia cut him off with a raised hand. "No need to explain," she said, her tone laced with irony. "Family trusts each other, don't we?" The door creaked open before Julian could respond, revealing Genevieve's shadow in the hallway. Talia had sensed her presence earlier, her eavesdropping a desperate attempt to cling to their crumbling plan. Genevieve stepped into the doorway, her face a mask of forced composure, but her eyes betrayed her, wide, searching, as if she could still salvage their scheme. Talia met her gaze, her expression unreadable but piercing. "Aunt Genevieve," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "you'll want to hear this too." Without waiting for a response, Talia stepped past her, glass still in hand, and walked back toward the grand hall. The party's hum grew louder, the guests' chatter a stark contrast to the storm she'd left in the study. She paused at the threshold, the crowd's eyes turning to her, their murmurs softening. They saw what Julian had crafted, a dutiful niece, a fortunate heir, but Talia was rewriting the script. She raised her free hand, commanding attention without a word, her presence filling the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear, resonant, cutting through the clink of glasses and whispered gossip. "Thank you for celebrating with me tonight. My Uncle Julian, unfortunately, is feeling under the weather and needs to rest." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd, but Talia pressed on, her tone unwavering. "But before he retired, he gave me the greatest gift, his trust, and with it full authority over my future and my father's legacy." The words landed like a thunderclap, subtle but seismic. Guests exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly, others whispering in confusion. Talia caught Genevieve's figure, lingering at the hallway's edge, her face pale, her hands clenched as if to hold back a protest. Talia's lips curved into a faint smile, not of malice, but of certainty. She dismantled their plan without raising her voice, without spilling a drop of the poisoned wine. She crossed the hall, the crowd parting instinctively, and approached a small side table near the grand staircase. With deliberate care, she set the glass down, its contents untouched, a silent testament to the truth. "This," she said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "is proof of our family's honesty." The words were cryptic to the guests, but to Genevieve, they were a dagger. Talia's eyes flicked to her aunt, catching the moment her composure cracked, her breath hitching as the implication sank in. Talia turned away, her steps steady as she moved toward the exit. The guests resumed their chatter, oblivious to the battle just won. She didn't look back at the glass or at Genevieve, whose shadow still hovered like a ghost of her former self. The contract in her folder was her shield, her father's will her sword, and this moment, her quiet, unshakable triumph was her crown. The party continued, but for Talia, the real work was just beginning. Seaview Point was hers, and she would protect it, no matter the cost. The ocean stretched before Talia, a silver expanse under the first light of dawn, its waves whispering secrets only her father had fully understood. She stood on the cliffside of Seaview Point, the land her father had cherished, its untouched beauty a stark contrast to the gilded cage of the Blackwood mansion. A month had passed since the night of her birthday, when she'd walked away from Julian's study with his signature on her contract and the poisoned glass as her silent witness. That night, she'd claimed her power. Today, she was shaping her future. The air was crisp, carrying the salt of the sea and the promise of a new beginning. Behind her, a small team of architects and environmental consultants gathered, their voices low as they reviewed plans spread across a portable table. Robert Sterling stood among them, his presence steady, a living link to her father's vision. Talia had spent weeks refining her proposal, an eco-resort that would preserve Seaview Point's natural splendor while honoring her father's dream of a place where beauty and community could thrive. It wasn't just land, it was a legacy, one she'd fought to protect. Her mind drifted to that night, the moment she'd set the glass on the table, its untouched contents a quiet accusation. The guests had seen only a poised young woman, but Genevieve had understood, her face drained of color as Talia's words, proof of our family's honesty, cut deeper than any shout. Julian's defeat had been sealed in the ink of her contract, a document that ensured her control while leaving him a hollow title as advisor. The irony was bitter. He'd sought to steal her inheritance, only to find himself bound by her terms. Back in the mansion, the Blackwoods world had unraveled. Julian's business associates, once fawning, now whispered of his financial missteps, their invitations drying up as rumors of his desperation spread. Genevieve, who'd clung to her socialite status, faced cold shoulders from her circle, her carefully curated image tarnished by the scandal's shadow. They lived on in the mansion, sustained by the modest stipends Talia allocated, her one concession, not out of kindness, but necessity, to keep them from sabotaging her plans. They drunk from their own cup, not of poison, but of dependence, a slow-acting venom of their own making. Talia turned to Robert, who approached with a warm nod. "Your father would be proud," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history. "Not just for saving Seaview Point, but for how you did it, without losing yourself." His words stirred a quiet ache, the memory of her father's letter. Trust your instincts. She'd done more than that. She'd turned instinct into strategy, outwitting those who dismissed her as an outsider in their pristine world. Genevieve's veiled jabs about her fit had only sharpened her resolve, a reminder that her strength came from roots they could never understand. She walked toward the cliff's edge, the architects' voices fading behind her. The plans for the resort included a cultural center, a nod to her father's heritage and hers, a space where stories like theirs could be celebrated, not erased. She'd insisted on it, a quiet defiance against the Blackwoods worldview, which had always relegated her to the margins. Seaview Point would be a beacon, not just of beauty, but of belonging. In the mansion, now under her ownership, Talia had made changes. The attic room was gone, replaced by a study where she worked late into the night, her law studies fueling her vision. The poisoned glass, preserved in a glass case, sat in the hall, a plaque beneath it, reading, "The truth always prevails." It wasn't revenge, it was a reminder, a symbol of the justice she'd served cold. Guests who visited, unaware of its story, admired its elegance. Only Talia and the Blackwoods knew its weight. Robert joined her at the cliff, his presence grounding. "You've turned the tide," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "This place will be everything he dreamed." Talia nodded, her heart full but steady. The victory wasn't just in saving the land. It was in reclaiming her voice, her place, her father's love. She thought of Julian and Genevieve, their lives now a shadow of their former grandeur, their defeat a mirror to her triumph. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the sea in gold, Talia felt a quiet peace settle over her. Seaview Point stretched before her, vast and unbroken, a canvas for her future. She wasn't just her father's daughter. She was her own architect, building a legacy that would outlast the greed that had tried to bury it. The wind carried her forward, and for the first time, she felt truly free. Thank you for joining Talia's journey, and they poisoned her glass at the birthday party. But in the end, they drank from her own cup. Her story of cunning, resilience, and triumph over betrayal is one we hope resonates with you. What did you think of Talia's strategy or the Blackwood's downfall? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear them. Until next time, thank you for being part of this tale, and we look forward to bringing you another story soon.